I tried looking earlier and nobody really has any of hers. Maverick.
Wait, did we check Maverick?
No. I wanted... Because other places sometimes have the bottles cheaper than at Maverick.
That's a fair point. Why didn't we check those other places first?
What do you think we were doing?
I think I have, like, the events of today mixed up, like, really bad.
Yeah, you do! I'm sorry, it seems like it's been a little late that the tomatoes came through. But don't let that rack your head too much.
It's fine. We'll be making bank soon enough.
Especially since Prince said, yeah, do as many as you need, clean them out. Like, okay. He sounded, the upset in his voice was like,
what do you mean?
His tone of voice was very terse when he mentioned those kids, like, start and do, like, 2 boxes and then give up.
He's like, please show them how it's done.
It's like, and all those tomatoes going to waste, it's like, yeah, come in, clean them out. I'd forgotten about that, actually.
But so... He basically went like... He basically decided that we don't need a limit.
The limit is however many boxes the tomatoes will give.
Whereas Colleen kind of looked at it like, give the other boys a chance.
Well,
give the other kids a chance. It's like,
I think it's more along the lines they were both on the same page and stuff. They looked at it, I mean, and one said, I mean, either way, they communicated to one another on some order that the tomatoes are still struggling. But then he went out there and looked himself and, like, saw that there were still a bunch out there that could have easily been picked, but there just wasn't anything there. So I think what's actually going on is the end of it we've been starting from, the kids have been starting from, because it's easier to get access there than it is the other end.
so
Because
basically...
you can drive down the dirt road and get to there.
So what you're saying is that we should start at the other end.
So that's what I'm thinking is going on, is they all ride down there, they all start from the same end, and, like, that's basically it for the most part. So if we start from the other end, we might find that,
Though we go 3 feet and manage to get
I hope
in a full box at least.
Yes. Like, I hope that's my hope, is that other end is basically like, done, 5 boxes in.
But what
No
about, like,
time.
what Colleen said earlier?
About?
Like, pick only 5 boxes to let the other kids get a chance.
We showed up afterwards, after the fact. And Brent was, like, not very happy with the fact that most of the kids basically come in, do onesie-twosie, and then leave. When tomatoes are in high demand, and especially...
So basically,
more than anything,
the
it's
10 boxes that we picked are probably gone by now.
from being bought out, yeah. But, you also consider, that there are tomatoes underneath the plants that they're not digging for.
Yeah, I know.
That are going to waste.
Yeah. Which ultimately makes our job harder because as the only tomatoes we can look for
are the ones that we have to dig for.
Yeah, which means that we have to move a lot more, and we get less boxes.
The kids are moving around quite a bit too, in general, because of their spot picking methods. Whereas
you mean their virgin spot picking methods that are less efficient than our Chad sit on your ass and pick them till the plant's gone, until it's nothing on the plant.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is like, they
you should make a meme about that.
They don't see the less work that they can do when they sit in one spot versus onesie-twosying it and picking what appears to be veins on the surface and then moving on to the next one that's on the surface. Whereas if you will actually wear gloves, which only cost $15 a piece, and
$15? I thought it was $5 last.
It depends.
No, that was a couple years ago.
It depends on the gloves you get. You can get them for $5 a pop, but if you want ones that are gonna live up to some of the beating, you pay for $15
at least.
Yeah.
Why don't you make a meme and show it to Brent about the Chad and Virgin thing?
Gosh.
Hey, he might like the humor behind it.
Maybe. But there's still somewhat like, will he get it?
Maybe. If he doesn't get it, you can just kind of give him a quick explanation.
Yeah, well, no, but
and the other kids should definitely get it. If you put it up,
that's debatable, because depending on how young some of these kids are, they may not. You're not getting another, right? Refill?
I don't have money.
Okay.
There are some regrets.
That's okay.
Mistakes were made.
I
know better now.
End of the week.
I'm going to save my money and then I'm going to buy a game.
Oh.
Should I go and try to buy military surplus?
What game are you gonna buy? Morrowind?
Well, it's kind of caught between synthetic and...
Hello?
Anyways, so... Oh, right. Military surplus. Now that I think about it, you know what's funny? So, British tankers were far more likely to get injured inside of a US tank. And British tankers as a whole were far more likely to get injured in tanks when compared to the US tankers. Do you know the reason for that?
Why?
They wear berets.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
I'm not sure why they get more injured in US tanks, but they get far more injuries in tanks because they're wearing berets. Not to mention they have far more deaths in tanks.
Is it because they, go back if they lose their beret?
No. No, they keep hitting their heads against things.
Oh my goodness.
Think about it, you get hit by a shell.
Gosh.
They get more head injuries. Why the hell would it be because of the... US tankers wear freaking helmets, Joseph.
Okay, I guess, yeah.
The tank commander, if I remember right, wears a steel pod helmet.
That's true, I'm like...
The US tank commander wears a steel pod helmet. Everyone else wears a different kind of helmet. But still, it's like hardened leather, at the very least.
So it's the hardened head where I'm like, why? What? Hitting their heads against everything?
It's like the US is using those really old leather football helmets.
Hey, thickened leather, okay? Does wonders.
That or it's like leather draped, like green dyed leather or whatever, just stretched over a piece of metal or something.
Hey, leather does wonders. Think about the leathernecks dealing with the Muslims back in the day.
I know. Although Jolly didn't get that when he was playing the game, but
Yeah.
whatever. Anyways, but yeah, it's like, you know, if I didn't see that, I wouldn't have known that.
I'm like, what kind of injuries are they getting?
It's like, how do they get injured? Are they going back into the tanks for berets when it's burning or something? It's like, wait, no, I can't leave my beret in there.
There are some people like that.
And then it's like, it's not because of the damn berets, it's because they don't wear helmets. It's like, oh, that makes a lot more sense.
Stupid. Stupid, dumb.
Well, it's like if you don't think about it that hard, it's like, how the hell do they get it? And then it's like, if it doesn't occur to you initially, then as soon as somebody says they keep getting head injuries, it's like, that makes a lot more sense. Because it's like, you notice, is like with like a lot of old pictures, you see U.S. tankers are wearing those like hardened leather helmets.
Yeah.
And then you look at British tankers. What are they wearing? Freaking berets.
At least
And a headset.
At least they have tea inside of them.
It's like, don't wear a freaking, like, I'm pretty sure they figured out the problem with doing it by now. Because I'm pretty sure pictures of modern British tankers show them wearing the same helmet as the U.S.
I don't know, sometimes you gotta wonder with Bongland.
But it's like, when you think about it, why would you not wear head protection inside of a tank? Like, you notice that even in the infantry fighting vehicles, there's a lot of hard edges and jagged things sticking out that could hurt you.
Just like the Cybertruck.
Well, worse than a Cybertruck.
I can't remember what game it was, but someone had modded the Cybertruck in, including the brakes in the side windshield from the baseball test.
I thought it was a metal ball.
Yeah, the metal ball.
Oh, whatever.
Oh, Elon walks out like, oh, it's cracked. Huh, we're gonna have to go back to the drawing board on that one.
You think he did that on purpose?
I'm pretty sure he was genuine, like, oh, this won't crack if we toss a metal ball at it, and then he comes out, he's like, that was not expected. We'll work that one out.
Anyways, so yeah, it's like it's like you look at all those new situations, and it's like, well, of course they've got head injuries. It's like the idiots were wearing freaking berets when they should have been wearing helmets.
Mm-hmm.
Then again, the Germans have the same problem. Like, I mean, seriously, they actually wear, or like, a beret or something similar.
It's the Army of the European Union.
And it's like, you got the one guy that talked about, like, that talked about, like, American tank myths before and all that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, oh my goodness, my tank is on fire guy. He was asked to speak about the tank myths. But he already talked about that and he put it up on YouTube, so he's like, okay, I'll give them something similar, but I'll do something a little bit different. He basically took it, modified it, and went back into it. It's like a little bit more in depth in certain areas, talks about more vehicles and tanks.
Yeah.
And it's like you had, in fact, at the end of it all, he had like the question and answers thing.
Yeah.
And one of the people asked him something about one of the tanks, and the guy had a second question. What would you say to try to convince the guy who wrote the book Death Traps about the M4 Sherman and why it's a death trap?
Yeah.
What would you do to try? What would you say to try to convince him? And he answered the first question, and then he answered the second question. And if I remember, actually, it's better said from the guy himself.
Better said from the man himself.
The Scotsman himself.
So, unfortunately, about as high up as it goes. Good evening! And the question is, why did the US make the, or order the, where, no, so to say that it's good enough.
Okay, that, I think was...
Very, very well. And this is why the wheeled tank destroyers, and I just showed you, never went anywhere. As for the armored cars, I can only assume the same thing. They had the Stewart agree that, yes, because the end result was could not have a tank. So, they had a tank, they just refused to call it a tank, hence you got a combat car. Formative and exciting. Whatever. He'll, again, the first person to shoot. So if you have a tank over there last week, the answer was, from the Churchills as well, there were Churchill funnies. I've read, is that, those, a small subset, not a complete subset of sorry, it's fine for the tanker to say, I wish I had more armor, I wish I had a bigger gun. How about the projectiles for and they wanted to know how effective the would be. It is possibly an exaggeration, but it's, I don't know if I can answer the question other than there was sufficient ammunition of all types. The ordnance brand say, aha, policy number one, higher flat, the prototypes are being tested. Still too late, and that again brings it back to the earlier question. That was one that they could have fixed, and they could have given about survivability rather than not as, but if you, when you, I'm thinking about the Calliope. So Germans, were talking about some on flat, the prototypes are being tested. And only once they said, and this was in April of 45, 75, the position of the person in charge in the US actually trying to ship these things overseas. Is it unfortunate? Is the position of the tanker is better than the position of the person in charge in the US actually trying to ship these things overseas. Is it unfortunate for the guy there? Yes, it is. No two ways about it. Is it still the better decision? I'd argue no. And I can happily, if you're going to go to the dinner afterwards, I will happily in Italy, 80 tankers were killed.
Okay.
A lack of realization even at the using level of what was required. So again, I'll go back to 6 Armored saying, look, we don't want any 76mm tanks. And probably the reason that they're saying that is because they never met anything that needed a 76mm gun. So if the people don't realize what they need, it doesn't matter how good your communication is with it enough. And that's probably where you're
Thank you. I'm going to ask a tangential question raised by your presentation as far as what the 2 biggest problems were for the U.S. going to war, and that was the Atlantic and the Pacific. General Smedley Butler wrote the book War is a Racket. And one of the things that I've always raised in talking about America's need to go to foreign war is that any enemy that attacks us, they can attack us, but they can never wage a war against us. The reason being is that you've got the lines of supply, the logistics of crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific, and to the north you have Canada and Mexico and the south. In your time in the military and studying military history, have you ever heard an argument that defeats that with regards to strategic planning for war, as to why we should not be more of a defensive nation versus an aggressive nation?
Doesn't that go back a little bit though to the where was the money going during the hard times in the 30s? It was going to the Navy, because they realized that if the priority number one for the military was to defend the U.S. territory, the Navy was the organization that was going to do it. So I have not heard any argument saying that yes, the opposition can come attack us on land and overthrow us once they've gotten past the Navy. Is that where you're going? I just yell.
To have anything more than a Coast Guard, there's really no need, because you may be able to attack, but you're not able to sustain that attack for any period of time. To sustain that attack for any period of time, as far as wage a war against the United States, there's no country in the world that could. And if they were going to have a sustained attack that was a war, it would have to either come from Canada or Mexico.
Agreed.
Nowhere else.
All right, yeah. The short answer to your question, I have not seen anything that would possibly argue against that. And even to support it, look at Operation Sea Lion. The German attack of 24 miles to get just across the English Channel. There's no way the Germans could sustain an invasion like that either. The Royal Navy would have a significant issue with it. That's assuming they could even come up with a plan. Right?
Yes, just getting to the Firefly.
Yes.
Do you know why I'm glad we live where we live?
Because nobody gives a shit.
This is such a stupid thing.
Let this Scotsman's voice calm you.
First place.
Hello. If Belton Cooper was here, the author of Death Traps, what would you say to try to change his mind or to debate it? My other question is, if the U.S. military had gone ahead and produced the Pershing and not the Sherman, what kind of problems do you think would have resulted on the battlefield?
Second question first. The problems of Pershing would be very similar to the problems of Panther. So we saw how good Panther was in its introduction in combat. Why would we expect that Pershing would be any different? So you would have lots of vehicles out there which are broken down. Theoretically, they could work, but even then you had limits. So America captures the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. The bridge is damaged. The infantry cross over. Fantastic. They need tank support. They call up, there happen to be Pershings on the far side. The Pershing cannot cross the bridge. The Sherman can cross the bridge. How quickly does it take an engineer unit to build a Bailey Bridge to class 4 versus to build a Bailey Bridge to class 5? And bridging, the engineers had a veto in tank design as well. They would always pass around to logistics and engineers and so on. Hey, Armored Force want this tank. Do you guys have a problem with it? And the transport guys will look at the dimensions and say, yeah, but it won't fit through a British railway bridge. And the engineers, their big question was bridging capacity. Will this thing hold the weight? So with Pershing, you would have a lame duck, which in theory, in a few circumstances, would be far better than the Sherman, but in most circumstances would not, for the level of combat that was going on at the time. Obviously, as technology and time developed to get to Korea, it's a different matter. To answer your first question, what would I tell about Cooper is all these tankers that you keep meeting that say, this is a death trap, how many of them were not dead? And the problem is that the entire premise is based on...
So, that there was pretty funny, though.
Yeah, that was... How many of them are not dead? It's gotta be
confirmation bias. His job was to repair destroyed tanks. All he sees are destroyed tanks. Destroyed American tanks. He does not see the tanks that were not destroyed. He does not see the German tanks that were destroyed, because why would he see them? So he's making his perception on a small subset, not a complete subset, of the data that's available to him. Now, whether or not I could actually convince the man who's, at the time would have been maybe 90-something years old that he's wrong, you just smile and nod and let him keep thinking, I guess.
One question is on, the famous funnies, especially used at D-Day, which is, I've read, is that those, minefield tanks, but also obviously the DD tanks were going to float? Was that part of kind of the initial design? Like, was the Sherman was designed for those kind of attachments?
No.
Or is that, okay.
There's actually a pretty good book about Hobart. I can't remember the name of it, but it's literally is just like yay thick, and all it is about Hobart and his command in the 79th. And the thing to remember, these funnies did not start with Sherman, they started with usually Valentines. So the ideas were worked out with British tanks, and then they were modified. And there were funnies from Churchill's as well. There were Churchill funnies. But they took the Sherman, because that's the next tank that was being built, and said, well, what can we do the same thing with the Sherman? And the answer was, yes, we can, because it is such a wonderful tank.
And just a quick question, how much of an advantage is the power turret traverse on the Sherman?
A lot. You may not have seen, I just published an article last week, and I got another coming out tomorrow, about the average combat range, or correction, not the average, the median combat range. So people realize that the average is about 700 yards. The median was actually about 300 yards. And if you are defending, let's say, you have a line of tanks, you can have a couple hundred meters between each tank. So if you have a tank over there and another tank or an anti-tank going 300 yards over there, that is a 60-degree slew that you got to cover, which means you need to have a nice big wide optic, which Sherman had, and you got to be able to traverse from here to here really quickly, because firefights are over very quickly. And again, the first person to shoot usually wins. 4 times out of 5, first person to shoot will win. So you get the Sherman gets over on the flank shot of the Panther or whatever. He'll get the shot off before the German tank will reply back. So yes, very important.
Sir, Major, Bob Perillo, ex-NSG, 10th Fleet. Excellent, informative, and exciting talk. Thank you so much, sir. For one minor correction, Gordon Welchman said that the Americans were better in crypto and radar, or slightly better than the Brits, but that the Brits were slightly better in ASDIC and MAGIC, EW and sonar than the Americans.
Magic.
Question about going from why we didn't have armored cars. We had the combat cars, why we really didn't have armored cars. There's a famous Tank Commander movie where the Tank Commander barks, where they depict a urban battle. And the Shermans are defeat some
You notice a lot of
tigers,
the guys asking questions are like,
with some armored cars. Because the Shermans were better.
They're not
for
asking
urban
questions,
warfare
they're
than the
expounding.
Tigers. My question is, armored cars were very good in urban warfare. And,
Expounding?
They're
we had the
expounding
combat cars.
background and
Why
things
didn't
instead of
we
just
go
asking
into the
questions.
armored cars?
They could ask
The combat
just
car
their
was simply a
question
workaround, because
rather than
by
giving
law,
million
Cavalry Corps could not
lines
tank.
and whole
So
entire
they
paragraphs
had
of
a tank, they
dialogue
just refused to call
to
it a
go
tank.
with
Well,
it.
if they're college
In
professors,
terms
that's
of
probably
armored
their
cars,
job.
the U.S. Army took a
They're really
look
bad at
cars
asking
as primary combat
questions.
vehicles as well. There was a vehicle called the Trackless
College
Tank,
professors and
which was
teachers
made by
are bad at
being
asking
tested about
questions.
1941.
If you're asking a
And
question,
initial
you're
testing was
asking a
very good. It was fast,
question.
it was quiet, had all
You're
the
not
advantages of an armored car.
expounding.
But there were some.
You're not giving a
reason
you're
why
not giving
until
a
very
lecture.
recently, armored cars were not as prevalent. When it
College
came down to
professor
general
instincts.
purpose combat,
No.
Yeah.
urban terrain was not as common back
I mean,
then
it's
as
like
it
you're
is
expounding
today.
this
So 70%
background.
of
It's
the
like, and
population
you're
are in
using the
urban terrain.
movie as your
Back
background,
then, it
no
wasn't
less,
the case.
too.
So you had to have your
You don't
tank
think
capable
this
of
guy
going
is aware of the
off-road
history
very,
that
very
is
well.
expounded in
And
the
this is why
movie
the
inaccurately?
wheeled tank destroyers, and I just showed you a few of them. They went all the way up to 3-inch guns. There were a lot of attempts at wheeled tank destroyers, but they never got to the same level of mobility as a tank. So that's why they never went anywhere. As for the armoured cars, I can only assume the same thing. They had the Stuart, they had the Chafee. The British liked their armoured cars. I don't know why. I've not looked into it.
Yeah, I tend to agree that, yes, because the end result was we won, so ergo, whatever we made was appropriate.
Okay, this guy.
But then again, you
He's
know,
going to try
your
to
argument
argue.
that in the procurement process, you look at the logistics, and you look at the Liberty ships, and you look at the rail. That's not an argument. Because the argument is what you got at the end result, is when you go into battle. And so, yes, the M4 is adequate.
Kind of a dick.
But there are battles lost because it was only adequate. Operation Goodwood, Operation Torch, these battles were lost. If you're going to end the war sooner, you've got to win those battles. So whatever was decided upon way back when, it's not an argument to say you can't put it on a rail line, and it's not an argument to say you can't put it on a Liberty ship. You make them fit the tank because you understand that there's 88s out there and that there's bigger tanks. You should have known that. Intelligence should have known that.
Is he talking
So to
about
say that it's
Americans
good enough-
transporting tanks over?
Yeah, pretty much. He's talking about, why didn't you make a heavy tank? That's what he's going at. He's like, they should have adopted the Pershing. They should have made it better. They should have made it work.
They had to harden their tanks before they could send it over. Because unlike the damn Brits, they've got to go a whole ocean across to send their crap.
Unlike the Brits, unlike the Germans, yes, I know. Now,
No, it isn't.
the Chieftain, if I remember right, he has his low reaction in as well.
The end users, I get a couple of, one, I don't know if Torch was really a loss. Goodwood, I would argue, did not fail because of the tank design. It failed because, due to manpower issues, the British simply did not have enough infantry.
It's a British thing too, so
It
they
was not
probably had 17
Monty's
houses.
first ideal plan, but the British Army was out of infantry. They had to send tanks in unsupported. And with the unfortunate and inevitable consequence, he made a gamble that the opposition weren't as heavily enforced as they were. He unfortunately lost. He didn't have a choice. He had to make the attack because Goodwood was a decoy for Cobra. But anyway, when it comes down, yes, the person in the tank at the time probably does not care about all the logistical things that ended up with him being there. There are two counters to this. One is that the general surveys that the American tankers had, and I've not seen the British ones, the American surveys basically said, we can handle the amount of armor we have. We need a better gun. Which, in the case of Goodwood, it was as I say, it was 88s. A little bit more armor probably wouldn't have made enough difference against 88s anyway. So that argument is academic. The other point is, yes, it's not very fair for the tanker to say, it's fine for the tanker to say, I wish I had more armor, I wish I had a bigger gun. How about his buddy over there, a kilometre that way, who was an infantryman about to charge a machine gun nest? What's his argument? Damn it, why can't the army build us tanks that are light enough that we can get 2 tanks here, so that not only does Joe have a tank, I also have a tank? So I don't see how you can say that one position is the position of the tanker is better than the position of the person in charge in the US actually trying to ship these things overseas. Is it unfortunate for the guy there? Yes, it is. No two ways about it. Is it still the better decision? I'd argue not. And we can happily, if you're going to come to the dinner afterwards, I will happily continue to engage you on this one, but we'll move on to another question.
So, do you think that his answer to the question was very appropriate?
Yeah, I think so. He acknowledged it's like the Americans have to ship stuff overseas. Unlike everyone else, pretty much. I mean, what are you gonna do when you have to ship things overseas? You're gonna make sure it works the way it's supposed to. You don't have the option to just let
another thing is that I noticed how the guy basically said they should have just made it so that everything works. And the thing is that one of the things that Chieftain pulled up earlier on in the video was is how it's a lot better to send two 30-ton tanks than one 60-ton tank. Which one sounds better to you?
Yeah.
And one thing you may note of is that because of the sloped armor on the Sherman, it had frontal armor equal to that, basically exactly the same as the Tiger 1.
Yeah.
But it was half as thick. Because of the slope. It was 2 inches thick. The Germans had 4.
It was designed that way on purpose. The Germans had the luxury of dragging the tank back to the factory.
Yes.
The Americans didn't, and they keep forgetting that.
And the U.S. also, like, early versions of the Sherman had an even more extreme slope on the armor.
Mm-hmm.
Which they kind of did away with due to certain issues. And it's like, when people argue, like, why the Sherman is a bad tank, it's really easy to argue why it's a good tank.
The Sherman's a bad tank because it had to be shipped overseas, unlike your little gay tanks, okay?
It's like, unlike the Tiger, I could get out of the Sherman in half the freaking time.
Yeah?
It's like, oh, hey, even on the earlier versions of the Sherman, if it was a 1943 version of the Sherman, I'd gladly sit in that thing.
The Americans cared about their manpower unlike everyone else. What's our priority? Getting the man out of the tank in case something happens. Okay, what after that? Making sure that they're well protected to avoid them needing to get out of the tank.
And, Joseph, one thing to make note of is that Chieftain even said the most modern tanks follow a similar example to the Sherman. Because some people would point out how the T-34 was better because it had sloped on side armor. You see, most tanks don't have sloped side armor because it's pointless, it's stupid. He practically said that. He's like, the Abrams has it, even Russian tanks abandoned it. The people who made the T-34 abandoned sloped side armor. It's like, it's like most tanks, it's like the Sherman had sloped frontal armor. Most modern tanks, sloped frontal armor.
Yeah.
Sure, it might not be as extreme as the Sherman, but they still follow that sort of logic.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, because the thing is that there's a very big drawback to having sloped side armor. Basically, if you want to have that sloped side armor, you have to make the tank wider if you also want to have a big gun.
Yeah.
Because having sloped side armor limits the size of the turret, which obviously limits the size of the gun.
Insert narrow tank that looks normal when stretched out to double wide.
Oh yeah, the Serv 74. Yeah, that thing. Yeah.
Insert pasta tank.
Because it's like, it's also really easy because it's like, which tank would you want to serve in World War II if you had to be a tanker? M4 Sherman, preferably a version after 1943.
Why is that?
Because that's when they started adding springs to the hatches. It's like the Sherman is probably already really easy to get out of, but as soon as you add that spring to it, it's like it becomes far more easy.
It's like the door opens itself.
Yeah, it practically opens itself. And that's something that makes the Sherman an incredibly good design. Because it's like the U.S. Army lived standardizing things.
Imagine standardizing and modularizing things being something that would help win a war overseas. Well, you have to think...
Like he was trying to call upon bullshit that what didn't exist.
Well, you also have to think that professors are basically sitting in ivory towers doing studies and stuff. And in a lot of cases, they're not humble enough to learn something from someone that they see as lower than them. If you don't have a doctorate or whatever, then you're not an authority.
Yeah,
and so therefore, you have
the chief didn't even acknowledge that. He said that he doesn't have the academic prestige. He acknowledged...
I don't have the academic prestige, but I actually studied it, unlike your asinine
Yeah, it's like...
knuckleheads.
He was asked to come and speak in front of them. It's like, the reason he pointed it out was because... he pretty much... That's the reason... He's pretty much... Him pointing that out and mentioning that he doesn't have the academic prestige, and then the way he talked to them and explained it to them, told me he was speaking in front of college professors.
Yeah. You also have to look at it this way, that they've been in a situation so long where I'm the professor and I've been talking to students, and they hardly learn anything because... So when some other guy that's actually studied it comes in and says, I don't have the academic prestige, immediately in their head it turns into...
He's like, I don't have...
I've got more than you, so that's all I need. I can't learn anything from you, and so they shut down.
It's like, I'm pretty sure the only reason that they listened to him is so that they could try to tell him he's wrong.
It's like a journalist. They sit there and listen just so that they can tell you how wrong and bad you are, or to dog on your story.
Whereas it's like with the one student, with one guy who came up with a simple question, you think that he was actually trying to learn?
Yeah?
It's like he asked two very simple questions. Would you say to try to convince this guy that he was wrong? And what would happen if we actually used the purging? It's like, I'm pretty sure the chieftain actually said it on multiple occasions that the purging was a piece of crap. And in fact, I remember him stating at one point that the purging was out. It was basically, some of the purgings were basically out of commission for 300 hours to 100 hours. 300 hours in the motor pool, getting fixed up to 100 hours in combat.
Yeah.
And that is clearly an unacceptable thing.
No, you cannot have that. If it spends more time there than otherwise, then no, you've got to figure something else out. And that's where the standardizing parts helps to reduce that time period. But at the same time, if there were no standardized parts on it that they could reuse from other tanks, why?
Yeah, and I said something to that effect earlier, that the only reason the Marines used it was because they had a massive surplus of parts, because the Army dropped them like a hot rock as soon as they figured out these things are still crap.
Yeah.
Because it's like, they adopted the purging for basically the post-war period. Because it's like, oh, well, now we can use these things. They replaced it with the tried and true Sherman.
Yeah.
It's like they basically just readopted the massive amounts of Shermans. And it's like, thing is that even in the 50s, the U.S. felt that it didn't have the capacity to really transport these things in large numbers.
Yeah, well,
It didn't have the railroad cars to do so.
That's the thing, is you have to think about how are they transporting these, and what's their transport network. And I think some of these professors forget that. It's like, we don't have teleportation. If we had teleportation, the war would have been over within days.
Because the U.S. would have teleported straight to Berlin.
I mean,
because it's like, you Germany. But yes, they forget that. They probably a part of the reason why they forget that is because travel is so quick today. You have air transport, which you can literally fly a tank from the U.S. straight to the Middle East in a C5 Galaxy. You can transport a platoon of M1 Abrams straight from the U.S. The Maverick that we went to earlier.
Where's the Maverick from earlier?
Fair enough. Sorry, Dad, no soda for you. Okay, so... But... Alright, one of the last questions was about the Calliope, the rocket Sherman. And the guy's like, why did the US do that? He's like... And the chieftain's like, I don't know. Actually, I think he asked the last question right here.
How uniform was the ammunition?
Oh.
The of 45 said that our problem is that our tanks haven't found any enemy tanks to shoot at.
Oh, right, that part I forgot.
Again, I put this up on the Facebook page. It is possibly an exaggeration, but I don't know if I can answer the question other than there was sufficient ammunition of all types except for HVAP, which had not been designed in July of 44, and only once they said, "Oh my God, we need better hitting," did the ordnance branch say, "Aha! Policy number one: higher velocity." Because remember, it's
higher velocity armor piercing.
Higher velocity. How do we get higher velocity? Lighter weight shot. How do we do that? TONK said, let's develop this, and they designed it very quickly. They designed it a month flat. The prototypes are being tested. Still too late, and that again brings it back to the earlier question. That was one that they could have fixed, and they could have given the American tankers.
Did we actually just get this for free?
Yeah.
Why do you think she did that?
I think it was kind of partially the disappointment of not finding Throwback, and probably,
Her feeling kind of bad for us?
I guess.
It's like, damn, Mom's gonna be angry.
Well, I mean, I think you can see when someone's been, like, casing around and stuff, too.
It's like, you can have it for free.
Oh, you walk into, like, up to three different stores and walk out. It's like...
Going on wild goose chase. Anyways.
Yeah.
And the American tankers would have been justifiably going, why didn't you think this? Now, and again, I'm saying this not knowing about what other uses the tungsten had. Could you have afforded to not stand up another factory with these tungsten-produced tools? I don't know, but my personal opinion is they could have fixed that ammunition problem and given them a better gun.
You mentioned at the end of your talk about survivability, and you mentioned that the crews were talking about survivability rather than being brewed up. Did the planners ever get into sloped armor? Did that ever come up with them?
Okay.
Thank you.
Again, I'm referring to the front of this Sherman. Is a sloped. Not as sharply, no, but it is thicker to compensate. So the effective armor between the T-34 and Sherman is almost to the millimeter the same. Now, the side armor is not sloped on a Sherman. It is sloped on the T-34. This brings you to a couple of problems. Firstly, your turret ring is smaller. You have a smaller turret ring, that means you have a smaller turret. You have a smaller turret, means you can't put as big a gun in it with, or you have less room inside. The other problem is that you're making your tank really, really big, but you don't have very much room inside the tank because of all the armor. So when you put your fuel, when you put your ammo, when you put your spare parts. So the Sherman, and if you look at a modern tank is like a Sherman. It's sloped at the front. But even the Soviets by the T-55 have given up on sloping on the sides because it just was not worth it.
I literally just talked about
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm thinking about the Calliope. You see pictures of them, they don't carry very many rockets. We're wasting a tank to fire a handful of rockets. The Germans are using half tracks. The Russians are using trucks. What was the theory about putting these rockets, the Calliope on top of a tank as opposed to another lighter, easy to produce vehicle?
The answer to your question is I have no idea. And I fully agree with you. And I have found reports coming back into the archive basically saying, why are we doing this? It must have made a good sense to somebody
somebody. I do not know who that somebody was, and I don't know what they were thinking. I'm sorry.
As somebody who has several versions of Sherman's in his miniatures collection, thank you for a great presentation. The tanks may have been the same, but the way the armor divisions were structured was not, and that varied even within the United States Army, and obviously with other armies. Just talk about, as the tank was the building block, just talk about how the armor divisions were structured, first within the U.S. system, and then the heavy armor divisions versus the other later ones, and then compared to some of the other nationalities that fought.
So unfortunately,
That's true.
Good evening.
It's just better to start at the beginning, I suppose.
So today's talk is on World War II vehicle procurement, or why the Sherman is as it was. That's actually not a very good title, but it was the best I could come up with when I was asked by Rob to say, hey, will you give us a talk? So on that, I would like to thank the NIMAS for inviting me out here, because I've seen some of the other speakers that have spoken here, and my God, there are some high-end personnel. I do not have any letters after my name. I do not teach at a university. I work for an unrealistic video game. So I'd like to thank them for taking the gamble and bringing this guy out who has no history whatsoever to give you guys a talk. However,
does he work with War Thunder?
Disreputable
War
background.
gaming.
As far as the academics are concerned, I do promise you that everything in here is either sourced from the archives
So World of
or
Tanks
is
and
as
stuff.
accurate as I could make.
Yes.
As far as the academics are concerned, I do promise you that everything in here is either sourced from the archives or is as accurate as I could make it. This thing will actually come across. We'll see. If Spaceman can't hear me, I'm sure they will make a mention. So, the background. Initially, I was asked to come here and do my Myths of American Armor talk. And I had to think about it. It's on YouTube. If you want to listen to it, go to YouTube. Google Myths of American Armor. You'll find it. And in this, I took some of the common conceptions about the M4 medium tank and, to an extent, the Pershing. And basically said, look, these are the common conceptions, and they are wrong. But because I had already given the talk, I said, well, look, let's modify it a little bit, and we'll go, instead of how good was the tank, we'll go with why is the tank the way it is? So that's the theory behind this. Now, I don't know your knowledge level. Again, some of the speakers I've heard you here on the podcast are very high-end. But every now and then, it's good to just go back to some of the low levels and make sure that the fundamentals are still good. So, audience participation question number 1. The rifle is the M1 Garand. What was better, out in service, common service, than the M1 Garand as a rifle? Pretty much nothing. You can make an argument maybe for the Sturmgewehr 44, but that wasn't as common. The M1 was probably the best piece of equipment of its type in the world, and the US produced it.
The M1 Garand is basically a hunk of wood designed to fire bullets from a
It's
clip.
basically a hunk of wood with a bit of metal stuck, with a complicated piece of metal stuck in it.
It's beautiful, okay?
Yes, but the Sturmgewehr, he said, you could say, it's like, no, you can't compare the Sturmgewehr to it. The Sturmgewehr 44 was a piece of crap. If you said MP43, then that might be something that holds water.
So,
you see, they're almost the exact same gun, except the Sturmgewehr 44 was made out of crappy materials.
yeah.
But the M1 Garand was the best rifle on the battlefield.
And I mean, it would still excel at many times in today's world, I think.
Well, the ballistics of 30-06 are almost identical to 7.62 by 51 NATO.
Yeah.
To 308 Winchester.
But if you hit a situation where you had to fight off people at a distance,
the M1 Garand would do it beautifully. It's like, it's simple.
No, but I mean the scope. It's like, dude, take the iron sights. They're beautiful.
Dude. If some dude in Finland, or was it Finland? The Winter War? It was between Finland and Russia, right?
I think it was Poland.
No, it wasn't Poland. If some dude in Finland could kill a crap load of Russians with a Mosin and gun, and without a scope, buried underneath snow with his mouth packed full of snow, dressed all in white, it can actually go out and massacre the Russians, then you can do it without all of that extra stress. You can kill a deer with iron sights. It's quite a lot bigger than a freaking man.
And you can kill a terrorist with iron sights, okay?
Exactly.
What was a better fighter than the Mustang? A better destroyer than the Goering? A better carrier than the Essex? A better artillery fuse than the VT? We had the best. Alright, land-based fighter. Or the non-combat stuff. No other country had the handy talkie. CCKW, deuce and a half. Higgins boat. Some people say the Higgins boat won the war, some people say the Jeep won the war. The Victory ship, we're putting these things out in 2 weeks flat. The record, I think, was 6 days in California. So, you can go on and
They
on.
had a contest.
With a couple of exceptions. I mean, the other countries had their own areas of expertise. I mean, we didn't touch the British with cryptography and some of the radar ASIC and so on. The British had us. The Germans had a few advantages and so on and so forth. But as a general rule, anything that the US went to war with was the best in the world that was out there.
Still has 2.8.
What happened? How did we go from the best at pretty much everything to this? I'm going to argue that actually we did not get it wrong. And that there were very specific decisions made in the US as to why the M4 ended up the way that it was. And over the course of the next hour or so, I've been asked to try to keep it to less than 60 minutes. I don't think I'll make it, but I'll try. Hopefully you guys will get an understanding of the levels
Well, I mean, professors have a hard time
thought
teaching under
that
2
went
hours.
into the design process. So, audience participation, question number 2.
You see
Hands
the
up for the
irony
chicken.
here.
Who votes the chicken? Who
He's talking
votes
about chicken
the
and the
egg?
egg.
Oh.
Alright, in 2006, the University of Norwich concluded it was the egg. However, that finding was later reversed by the universities of Sheffield and Warwick in 2010. In a paper entitled Structural Control of Crystal Nuclei by an Eggshell Protein.
Actually, 1 second.
Current scientific thought, therefore, indicates that the answer to your chicken or egg question is the chicken. So I bet you've learned something this evening. My mission is complete. Now, why do I ask? Any guesses? Sir? Okay, so how would that apply to this talk?
Most people are going by the information determined by looking back and hearing what people are saying about it, as opposed to looking at as the moment is being designed.
That is an excellent point. That is not the answer to this question, but it is actually a very good point. And I was mentioning earlier how I was talking about British Army operations in Northern Ireland, which I, to an extent, I lived through. But then I did an assessment of it last year for the Army, and it's very interesting, the different perspective, depending if you're involved in the matter or if you're dealing with it after the fact objectively. Sir? You're getting there.
Chicken and the egg are actually different times of the same thing. It's a continuous process of creation of the egg. That's what chicken is. That is actually the same thing.
That's deep. That's very deep. Here are your chicken and here your egg. On the left side is a symbol for Army Ground Forces. These are the guys who developed doctrine, they equipped the force. On the right-hand side is the bomb of Ordnance Branch. Ordnance Branch are the guys who developed the equipment. So, the question is, should doctrine match the technology that is being created? Or should technology be geared towards meeting whatever the doctrine requires? So, here's your next question. Audience participation question number 3. Who thinks that doctrine drives the technological design? Okay. Who thinks that the technology drives what the doctrine does? Okay, a few more people. Who doesn't care? Okay, so this is Gladian Barnes. I've referred to him as the mad scientist of the US Army. He comes up with all these wonderful designs and pieces of equipment, and he believes that he knows better than everybody else what the Army needs. And to quote him, for those of you back who can't read, "It is not well understood that tactics are usually written around a weapon. Thus, field operations ordinarily do not generate ideas leading to new materiel. A new piece of equipment must first be..."
Part of the problem with that idea of it being written about around it is that the guys working in developing new tanks.
Yeah.
Tanks are something that are already kind of there, right?
Kinda.
It's like, to a degree, he's right. Except that's generally new technology.
Yeah.
Not technology that's technically been around. Like, sure, the US is still kind of trying to figure it out. And you noticed how when he asked the question, does technology drive doctrine? He said, yeah, a few more hands. I'm guessing that was all the professors.
Well, yeah. There will be some things that change with an adaptation of technology.
Yes.
But in many ways, generally when you've got people looking at developing a new technology, it's because there is a need in the field, and they need to fill that need.
Exactly. Like, because back in World War II, you actually had people requesting for a technology that would allow a tank going under a certain speed to be able to detect a mine.
Yeah.
And stop before it touched the mine. Basically, you had it would detect a mine that was at least 5 feet out.
Yeah.
If not 10.
Yeah.
They were requesting that. They haven't gotten that today, but still. It's they were requesting it back then.
Produced, such as, for example, a machine gun, before the tactics can be devised for the exploitation capabilities of the weapon. For these reasons, it is necessary for Ordnance Department to take a strong lead over the using services in the development of new equipment, and then to get the help of those services in determining where the weapon best fits into battlefield operations. So, if you talk to Ordnance, technology drives doctrine. And it's kind of hard to argue the fact that, well, how can you know how to use a machine gun if you didn't know that such a capability exists? However, this is what Army Ground Forces thought. The bottom line here is that Army Ground Forces would draw up the specifications, and they would then be submitted to Ordnance, and Ordnance would then design equipment to match what Army Ground Forces wanted the equipment to do. And the quote is from the written history of Army Ground Forces. I have a picture of it now up there. Yeah, granted, in 1940, Army Ground Forces didn't exist as a entity, but we'll leave that aside. Now, if you're curious, so just to be clear here, we have the users saying that they're in charge, you have the developers saying that they're in charge. And both have actually reasonable arguments. If you're curious, this is the process today. And I've had to learn this as part of my majors course, and I am very glad I'm not involved in procurement. This is the Army's side of it. If you can understand this, you're a better man than I. But the bottom line is that in today's military, it is driven by the operational needs, not by the technology. So you start off with, let's say, an operational needs statement. Such as, for example, the 30mm strikers that are now being fielded in Europe. This came from the field. The 2nd Brigade said, we need vehicles with a cannon capable of engaging BMPs. And then the engineers went and they built them a vehicle with a cannon and now got fielded. Such operational needs statements did exist in World War II. For example, there was one lovely one I saw that says, we want a device that you can fit onto a tank, that when it's driving along at least 15 miles an hour, it will detect a minefield before it hits the mine. Now, we haven't really gotten to that today, but these requests were being fielded from the field to Ordnance, and a lot of times Ordnance did develop materiel which met the requirements of the fielding force. But anyway, again, I digress. The bottom line is that Ordnance thought that they were in the lead and AGF thought that they were. So if we go back to the start, before the US joined World War II, you can see what Army Ground Forces said the equipment of the Army was, and it was terrible. Basically, the US was starting from scratch. So reduced it to its simplest terms, the problem is to determine the kinds of equipment which would be needed most and could be manufactured in the required hundreds, thousands, or millions in time to be of use. And again, that's a quote from AGF. Note, in time to be of use. You're going to mortify, you can't hang around waiting for the perfect piece of equipment. Now, in January of 1940, in a lecture before the Army Industrial College, the then Chief of Ordnance, Major General C.M. Weston, estimated that the development of a major item of material required a minimum of 3 years from requirement to fielding. Now, in the exigencies of war, they cut that down to usually 1.5 to 2 years, sometimes even as little as 1. And this timeline generally matches with the development of any piece of equipment developed by anybody else, the British, the Germans, the Russians, about 1.5 to 2 years. Yes, audience participation question number 4. In one word each, what are the 2 biggest problems facing the United States as it prepared to fight World War II?
Can you tell me what the issues are? 2 biggest problems.
Supply?
Nope.
No.
2 biggest problems. What is the 2 biggest problems for the U.S. when it was getting ready to fight World War II?
Support.
Production, logistics, shipping. You guys are very close. You're bouncing around the right idea. Bingo. The 2 problems are called Atlantic and Pacific.
Makes a lot more sense now, doesn't
Yeah.
Anything which is being built to fight is going to be fighting many thousands of miles away and a couple of oceans from your nearest factory. It has to get there, and when it is there, it must also be sustained. So this means that you need to have as few parts break as possible in order to reduce the need for spares to be shipped over, the need to ship those spares, and then you've got all the consumables like POL, petroleum, oil, lubricants, across the ocean. And note also that unlike the Germans, who could, if they had to do a complete refurb on a tank, they could ship the tank back to the factory, well, so could the Soviets if they had a need to. We could not. Anything that we sent over was there to fight until it was either discarded or destroyed. So major repair in the US is not an option. And you have to think about the entire chain, from the factory floor to the battlefield. Now here's an example of one of the problems. In 1948, there were 12,122 flat cars in the United States which should carry a Pershing tank. In May of 48, they had an exercise, and they wanted to get a battalion of Pershings from Fort Knox to Fort Campbell, the other end of Kentucky. It took 40 days to collect all those flat cars. And that was in 48. So if you go back to, say, 42, how many flat cars were capable of carrying a 45 to 50 ton tank? And everything else that had to be carried to get to the ship. And then when you got to the shipyard, you have Liberty ships that we've been building once every 10 days. What is the lifting capacity of a Liberty ship crane? If you make these 60-ton monsters, can you actually get it to the fight? Arguably, well, you probably could, but could you get them in sufficient numbers to have an effect? So again, in the simplest words, what use is having the best equipment in the world if you can't get it to the fight? Or if it gets to the fight, then it breaks down. No use. You just wasted all that shipping, all that effort to get a tank overseas just to see it break down and sitting in the 3rd Armored Division motor pool, or wherever. So that's some of the basic problems. So let's get down to some of the nuts and bolts. So, again, I'm going to quote Army Ground Forces. AGF established 2 general criteria for the development and approval of new equipment. The first is genuine battle need. It was reluctant to initiate development of any equipment not considered essential to increase combat efficiency. It tended to oppose development of new equipment which, though perhaps desired by the men in the field, was not absolutely essential and might prove to simply be a luxury or excess baggage. This was a clear-cut policy of General McNair, one which he often emphasized. It was eventually adopted formally as War Department policy. So who determines battle need? Who determines what is an essential piece of equipment versus what is a luxury equipment? So one school of thought said the theater commanders. The other school of thought said that the decision should be centralized in the US. Who thinks they went with theater commanders? Who thinks they went with centralized decision in the US? You are all wrong. I see where you're going on that. That was done centrally, yes, but once the TO&E was set up, like we will have so many personnel, we will have so many tanks, the actual nature of those tanks and improvements to them was not centralized, and I should explain. So the reasoning from the idea behind the guys who wanted a centralized decision was that theater commanders might be too strongly influenced by the limiting local conditions of their own tactical situation to exercise proper overall judgment, which seems a little bit distrusting in the reasoning of 4-star generals. They also believed that theater command...